If God created everything, then does that mean that he also created evil? Because where would evil come from if God wasn't the one who created it? But if that's true, then how could a good, holy God create evil? And how do you explain Isaiah 45:7 where God says that he created evil? Does that really mean what it sounds like? That's what we'll be covering in today's video. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I'm a youth pastor, and my goal is to teach the Bible and to help you follow Jesus. The existence of evil is one of the most confusing questions that Christians face, because we might wonder why evil exists if a good God created everything, and how could a holy God be the creator of evil? But if God didn't create evil, then where does it come from? Who else or what else could have created it? Well, in answering this question, we're going to look at one of the most confusing verses in the Bible, which is Isaiah 45:7. It says, I form the light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil, I the Lord do all these things. So did God create sin? And if not, then what does this verse actually mean? Well, we're going to consider three things here. Number one is the original Hebrew word that's translated as evil. Number two, what that word actually means. And number three, the context of Isaiah 45:7. Now, the Hebrew word that's translated as evil is ra, and throughout the Bible, ra is translated in many different ways. It's translated as evil, wickedness, wicked, mischief, hurt, bad, trouble, sore affliction, ill, adversity, ill-favored, harm, not, noisome, grievous, and sad. So as we can see, evil is not the only way that ra is translated. And when trying to figure out what the words of Bible verses mean, it's helpful to remember that words often have multiple meanings based on the context in which it's said. For example, if I said that it's dark outside, that would mean that it's not bright outside and that it's hard to see. But if I said that we're living in dark times, that would mean that we're living in an evil world or a wicked culture. So from that example, we can see that a word like dark has multiple meanings. And the same thing is true about the word evil or the Hebrew word ra. Because sometimes evil refers to moral evil, such as wickedness or sin, but it can also refer to things like calamity or adversity or affliction. And when Isaiah 45:7 says that God created evil, evil is being used in the second sense of the word. Evil here does not mean sinful, it means calamity. And when we look at the context of the verse, we see that God is speaking about contrasting concepts. God talks about how he creates and forms different things, demonstrating his sovereignty overall. First, he says, I form the light and create darkness. Light and darkness are opposites, and yet God makes and uses both. And then he says, I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. So just as light and darkness were opposed, now peace and evil are opposed. The opposite of light is darkness, and the opposite of peace is calamity or unrest, not sin, although peace and sin are different things. So when we see the word evil here, it does not mean sinful or unrighteous, so this verse should not be used to say that God created sin. Now, to interpret this verse this way, it's not changing the meaning of the word evil, it's just recognizing that evil can mean multiple different things. It doesn't have to mean sin or unholiness, because it can also mean trouble or affliction. So what is this evil or calamity that God creates? Well, as a sovereign ruler of the universe, God sometimes uses disaster to accomplish his will and bring people back to him. For example, God used things like the flood, the 10 plagues, and Babylonian captivity to punish sinners, to save his people, and to bring people back to him. God makes both peace and calamity to do what he knows is best. So now that we've got Isaiah 45 settled, and we know that this verse is not saying that God creates sin, we still have the question, did God create moral evil? Did God create sin? Because it seems that if God created everything, then he must have created evil, because how else would it exist? Well, the truth is, evil does not exist on its own. It's simply the absence of good. For example, think about a hole in the dirt. That hole couldn't exist on its own. It's just simply the absence of dirt. If there is no dirt, then there could be no hole in the dirt. And the same thing is true about evil. Evil is the absence of good, and evil is only able to exist because good exists, which means that evil couldn't exist on its own, because it's just the absence of good, just like how a whole can't exist on its own. Now that's not to say that evil doesn't exist, because it certainly does, but evil isn't something that exists by itself or on its own, because it's just the absence of something else, which means that evil was not created. Similar to how the whole of a donut was never created. Nobody had to make that whole, they just made the donut, and that donut whole is just the absence of a donut. And likewise, evil doesn't exist on its own, it's simply the absence of good, just like how darkness is the absence of light, and how coldness is the absence of heat. And since evil is the absence of good, that means that evil didn't have to be created, it just exists. So God didn't create evil, he just created good. God did not create moral evils or sin, and he couldn't have, because he's holy and righteous in everything that he does, which means that sin and evil can't come from him. And here's 4 Bible verses that demonstrate that. In the creation account, it says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." God created everything, and he said afterward that it was very good. Now, if God had created sin, then this could not have been said, because evil is not good, so evil was not a creation of God. Sin was the free will choice of man, not the creation of God. 1 John 1:5 says, "This then is a message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." God is light, which means that he's perfect and holy, and God has no darkness at all. So how could sin or imperfection come from him? Well, the answer is that it can't, and it doesn't. The third passage is James 1:13, which says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." God can't be tempted with evil, and he doesn't tempt us with evil. So God can't sin, and he never invites us to sin either. And while God does allow us to have the ability to sin, God never draws us or causes us to sin, because that's not in his nature. And then the 4th verse is Titus 1:2, which says, "In hope of eternal life, which God that cannot lie promised before the world began." This verse shows us that God can't lie. Not that he doesn't or chooses not to, but that he's unable to. And the reason for this is because God is perfect and holy. And if God were to lie or commit any sin, that would break his nature. And because God is perfectly sinless, it's not within his character to create sin or moral evil. Now, while God did not create evil, he did allow for the possibility of evil, because he chose to give man a free will. And if evil didn't exist, then we wouldn't have a true free will. And if we didn't have a free will, then we would worship and serve God not out of choice, but out of obligation. But God didn't just want robots or mindless beings. He wanted a real relationship with his creation. And God allowed evil to exist so that we could have a true free will and the ability to either accept or reject him. And this is shown by the fact that when God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he gave them the choice to eat from the different trees, including the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gave Adam and Eve a choice, and they had a free will between right and wrong. But while God does allow evil to happen, it doesn't mean that he's the creator of it or that he condones it, because that would contradict his holiness and his goodness. Now, one of the biggest questions people have is, why does God allow evil and suffering to happen to people? And if you've ever wondered that, then check out this video. Also, if you want, check out my podcast called Following Jesus, where we're currently going verse by verse through the book of James. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more biblical teaching like this.